Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette. I think this is 109. Let's go find out. Might 109. How do you like that? Where we read philosophy papers we find on the internet and review them. It's cool. It's awesome. Welcome. Okay, so what did we do? We did something from Mind earlier today. Let's look at philosophy and the cognitive sciences because this is just where the webpage was left off. Let's see. Something reasonably worth reading. Short. Let's see, we got this one. Temporal experience and anxiety. Embodiment, self, and the collapse of meaning. Okay, that's cool. Let's see if that's available. Let's see what else we have here. Addiction is temporal disruption. These look like fun. That's 14 pages, a little longer. Temporal experience as a core quality in mental disorders. That's what is that? 9 pages. Oh, I know. This is gonna be a sciencey thing, so it's gonna be have like little, very small font and stuff. No wonder they're short. Okay, so I have to get something like twice as short. Mental perspectives during temporal experience and post-traumatic stress disorder. All right, so let's see what we got. How long was that? Yeah, so 13 pages is really like 20-something pages. This is another. This is 11 pages. The self and dance movement therapy and narrative approach. Movements of recognition, deontic power, and bodily felt demands. That could be... Alright. These all sound like a lot of fun. Let's see what's available. Quick. Doesn't look like it's available. Doesn't look like it's available. Well, at least it's not on. Felt papers. I mean... Okay, so... Nope. Nope. Mental. Okay, let's see how bad this one. What's the damage on this? Okay, so double spaced N22. That's very reasonable. So this is looking very. Alright, so we've got temporal. Let's see if this is actually here or is it. Okay, so this one's open access. Let's see how long this one is. Clicky, clicky, make with the clicky. So it's 10 pages, but single spaced. Okay, so both looking pretty good. What am I doing? Indigenous temporal disruption by Kemp. Yeah, alright, so this one's here too. 2018. Alright. This is 25, so you're losing out because the other ones were shorter. Sorry, Kemp. Kevin Aho. Let's see if this one's here. Anxiety. Okay, so we got this one. Alright, so this is kind of cool. And 1 to 12, again, single space. Okay, how do we decide between these now? Alright, so this is 1 to 10. This is a thematic, that's an editorial. Okay. Temporal experience and anxiety versus mental perspective during post-traumatic stress disorder. What do we like? Anxiety or post-traumatic distress? Because they're both temporally themed experiences. I mean, okay, coin flip time. Let's see. So, heads or 0 is going to be this one. Tails or 1 is going to be this one. So we're going to pick a random thing that will get us the first number I'm going to see, basically. What's the first number we can see on Twitch? Oh, Mr. Llama. I was watching Mr. Llama before Diablo 2. So let's find out the first number we find on the page. Where's the first number? Where's first number? Upload season 1 trailer. Okay. How is Mr. Llama undoing season 1? Alright. He was playing Diablo 2 like 10 minutes ago. Okay. So something's just wrong here. Doesn't matter. This one was 1, this one was 0, so we're doing this one. Mental perspective. Alright, so let's actually, oopsie. Alright. And if you want to join me live, which I hope you do one day, and you can suggest a paper, I appreciate that, so I don't have to run around trying to find stuff. You show up in the chat, you can type !paper, and you get a link to it. The link will pop back up, and if you're watching later on YouTube, there'll be a link below in the show notes. And that'll get you to this page here, which you can then just click on Scholar or whatever and get and download. So, that wasn't too painful. Sometimes I go like 10 minutes without finding anything to read. And that makes me sad. But that's okay. Alright, and we are off. Introduction. Studies suggest that a single thought about one's past or future involves what we might want to call 3 different mental perspectives during these temporal experiences. In field versus observer perspective, a past or future thought is cognized either as if one were looking at a past or future image from within one's body, field perspective, or from a mental perspective that is outside one's body, observer perspective. The distinction between field and observer perspective is, for instance, relevant for depression, social phobia, and schizophrenia. In ego-moving versus time-moving perspective, one either conceptualizes oneself as moving toward the future, ego moving, for example, I'm approaching my birthday, or the future as moving towards oneself, time moving, my birthday is approaching. For example, for this. Okay. Time moving perspective can relate to depression, anxiety, and a low sense of self-agency. Okay, so the time moving one is which one? Moving, so when my birthday is approaching, so the object-based one versus the ego-based one. Okay, time-based moving perspective can relate to depression, anxiety, and a low sense of self-agency. In specific versus overgeneral perspective, one retrieves an episodic, personal past or future scenario either as a specific, distant, or as an overgeneral, indistinct, vague event. Okay. Overgeneral past or future thoughts have been identified in relation to a number of psychological disorders. For example, in relation to depression, posttraumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, people with suicidal thoughts, and bereaved adults with complicated grief. Thus, each of these 3 mental perspectives during temporal experience potentially relates to psychological disorders. This article will lay out potential therapeutic use of 3 mental perspectives for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. PTSD is a severe mental disorder that may develop following exposure to potentially traumatic events such as rape, war, torture, or serious accidents. PTSD core symptoms include trauma memory-related recurrent distressing dreams, nightmares, repeated intrusive daytime images, flashbacks, efforts to avoid internal or external reminders, activities that are associated with re-experienced events, and hyper-arousal in the form of hypervigilance or exaggerated startle response. Note that all these PTSD core symptoms relate to temporal experience, to an involuntary preoccupation with the past. A succinct way of putting this is to say that people with PTSD are stuck in the past. Okay. Alrighty. Field and observer perspectives in post-traumatic stress disorder. There are 2 basic perspectival ways how people phenomenologically report seeing a mental image involving the self, including memory and future thought images. And both ways relate to mental representations of bodies. People report seeing either an image either from within a mentally represented body, as if through the body's eyes, or from outside a mentally represented body, as if one is mentally looking from a body exterior point of view at one's own body. In relation to episodic memory or episodic future thought, the former, mental body internal perspective, has been referred to as a field perspective, Thus, in a field perspective, one's experiences one's memory as if one is looking out from within one's own body. The latter, mental body external perspective, has been referred to as an observer perspective. In an observer perspective, one mentally experiences one's memory from outside one's body, looking at oneself from a body exterior vantage point in the mental image. Field memory perspectives are known to evoke stronger affective reactions, physical sensations, and psychological states, while observer memory perspectives are known to retrieve more environmental aspects of the memory, such as object location and remembered surroundings. Neurophysiologically, increased activity has been found in 3 distinct brain regions for field relative to observer memories, fMRI. 1. Bilateral insula and right posterior dorsal insula, left somatosensory and right motor regions, and left lateral occipital complex, and 3. Right posterior amygdala. Since more amygdala activity relates to higher levels of affective processing and more insular and somatosensory activity to higher levels of interoception, we may note that people who do not only phenomenologically report that they mentally process memory as if they are either within their body's field or outside of it, but that the brain processes also reflect this. Okay. It's weird. My memory just seems to be always different from other people's. I think I'm mostly field. I don't have much of this external sort of memory. Okay. So I don't quite actually understand what it is to look at myself in my memories. I don't know if I have much of that experience, but it's interesting. A number of studies have investigated field, sometimes also called self-immersed perspective versus observer, sometimes also called self-distance perspective in individuals with PTSD. McIsaac and Ike found that individuals with PTSD rate their trauma memories as more emotional when they remember them from a field perspective as compared to when they remember them from an observer perspective. For this finder, McIsaac and Ike simply asked the PTSD participants if they generally remember the traumatic event from a field or observer perspective. In contrast, when individuals with PTSD are specifically instructed to take on a field or observer perspective while recalling a traumatic event, this has no effect on the subjective emotional reactivity measured with self-report scales. However, being instructed to take on an observer perspective for such memories still significantly reduces physiological emotional reactivity, resulting in decreased heart rate and skin conductance. PTSD symptoms are also associated with an increased tendency to spontaneously take on an observer perspective when recalling a traumatic memory, a tendency that prospectively predicts the development of PTSD. Furthermore, a recent article on highly traumatized Sudanese refugees with PTSD who survived genocide and related atrocities found that a field perspective during trauma memory recalled led to lower levels of avoidance. Taken together, these findings give some empirical support for the initial speculations of McIsaac and Ike, who, in their conclusions, state that the adoption of an observer vantage point during or after a traumatic event, especially if it is maintained during subsequent recollections of the experience, has important potential implications for therapy. The problem is that the persistent use of the observer vantage point may prevent the fear-relevant information from becoming available for modification, and thus impair emotional processing. Thus, if a person continues to use the observer vantage point over the course of therapy, the desired decrease in fear that accompanies repeated exposure may not occur. In other words, the short-term relief from emotional distress that is gained by adopting an observer vantage point may actually impede long-term recovery. I conclude this section with a specific idea how the field perspective could be induced in trauma therapy. If an individual with PTSD might now have the described tendency to retrieve trauma memories only excessively from an observer perspective, and if the therapy setting asks for more vivid retrieval of the trauma memory, for instance exposition or exposition-like therapeutic strategies, then these patients could, for instance, be encouraged to recollect a trauma memory in that they move their eyes as if they were in the midst of their memory and as if they were looking at the mental scene from within their body. So they'd sort of, embody their memory in some sense. Interesting. These individuals with PTSD could thus assist their attempt to adopt field perspective by acting out the field perspective with their eyes. Such an embodied oculomotor approach to field observer perspective also finds indirect support from eye tracking research on mental imagery. There is growing evidence that mental images are acted out by our eyes. Thus, when people, for instance, imagine looking up or looking up more and more along a tall building, imagining this is accompanied by corresponding upward eye movements. Interesting. Okay, so some nice little pictures of people looking at themselves in pictures. Okay, so figure 1, I am not going to... you can read the figure caption if you wish to. Okay, I think this is part 2. Ego and time moving in post-traumatic stress disorder. In this section, I will discuss the relevance of 2 major forms of thinking about the future, called ego moving and time moving metaphor in relation to PTSD. I will thus first introduce the concept of the ego time moving time metaphor. As a starting point, please consider the following question and try to answer it for yourself before continuing to read. Alright, so next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days, so I guess I'd make it on Friday. On what day will the meeting now take place? Next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days, so it will be the Friday after next Wednesday, so it would be a week from this Friday. Okay, I don't think that was... I wonder what the punchline is there. Numerous studies have confirmed that, all other things being equal, about 50% of the participants who are asked this question answer Friday, the other 50% Monday. Oh, what do you mean forward? Moved up or moved ahead? Okay, I see what they're saying. Let us first try to turn the case where people answer Friday. The studies that people who answer Friday only at the moment when answering, at other times it might be different, are likely to unconsciously mentally represent time as if they are moving through time and time itself is stationary. Oh, interesting. So that's kind of fun. So this is time intuitions here. That is, in such a moment, one perceives oneself as having a rather active role in time. One mentally moves through it, and perceives time as having a more passive role, as time is being moved through and has no active component to itself. Why does Friday imply that one moves through time? For an illustration, please think about the future as it being ahead of you. Well, I mean, where else would it be? Which involves the concept that the mental timeline is going away from you. The more ahead of you, the more into the future. Now, if you think of yourself as moving through time when looking ahead, then forward means further ahead, further in the future along the timeline going away from you. Because you perceive yourself as moving forward in time, moving next Wednesday's meeting forward also moving next Wednesday's meeting forward also means that it is further ahead in the future, further ahead in front of you, and 2 days further ahead into the future from Wednesday, that is Friday. Let's turn to the second possibility, the case where the people answer Monday. Here, the study suggests that people who answer Monday, again only at the moment when answering, at other times it might be different, are likely to unconsciously mentally represent an event as the event were moving toward themselves, and they themselves are stationary on the timeline, mentally watching time coming towards them. Thus, in such a moment, one perceives oneself as having a more passive role in time. One remains stationary and merely watches time, but perceives time itself as having a more active role, time that is unconsciously conceptualized as moving. Why does Monday imply that an event on the timeline is in approaching motion while one is watching the event from a stationary position? Please think again about the future as being ahead on the timeline, which is going away from you. Now, if you think of yourself as watching from a stationary position as time coming towards you, then forward applies to the event itself, to the forward motion of the event that is approaching you. So if you perceive yourself as stationary in time and time is moving toward you, then moving next Wednesday's meeting forward means that it is further from the point of view from the event approaching you, 2 days more toward you from Wednesday, that is Monday. Oh, so that's a little bit of fun. So we got temporal intuitions here. Don't know if I have anything interesting to say about that, but it's sort of a fun thing, because how do you, of course forward and backwards are relative, but this is forwards and backwards relative to how you understand the ontology of time, which is not normally what I'm making things relative to. Alright, so the Friday type is often described as involving an ego-moving metaphor conceptualization, since one conceptualizes oneself as moving and time as being stationary. I think I've read too many things on the 4D metaphysics, and you've got like growing block theories. So you've got like this concept of a block, it's sort of like stationary, and you've got like the time is just sort of fixed. Yeah, so that's probably that may be where I got this from. And the Monday type is often described as involving a time-moving metaphor of conceptualization, since here one conceptualizes oneself as stationary and time is moving. So maybe these are the spotlight theorists here, the ones that are like the moving spotlight, who only think the realness is the spotlight. And then there's the growing block theorists who think that you've got the entire sort of like block of time, and that's what's really happening. So this might be some interesting psych research that would actually break down according to the metaphysics, or the metaphysics might break down according to the psych research, which is interesting because the ego here is involved as opposed to, so your ego might actually represent your metaphysical position or have something to do with it, which would be fun. Okay. Ego-moving and time-moving thinking frames have also been found to relate to clinically relevant psychological states and traits, investigated almost exclusively in healthy samples, both scales and questionnaires that are also used in clinical psychology and psychiatry. While higher levels of self-perceived happiness have been found to relate to an ego-moving mode, higher levels of self-perceived anxiety and depression have been found to relate to a time-moving mode. One could still add a whole list of other behavioral correlates between conceptualizing ego time-moving metaphors and important psychological states and traits. For instance, higher levels of self-perceived aggression related to ego moving and lower levels to time moving. Feeling that one has a higher degree of self-agency relates to ego moving and a lower degree to time moving. Being extroverted relates to being more ego moving, and being introverted to more time moving. Needing a shorter, hypothetically estimated period for grieving relates to ego moving, and needing a longer period to time moving. Imagining or describing a positive event relates to more ego moving, and negative event to more time moving. Having a tendency for procrastination relates to more ego moving. Having a tendency for conscientiousness to more time moving. Phenomenological accounts of patients with PTSD seem to suggest that their temporal experience might relate to a time-moving thought. As mentioned in the introduction, a typical characteristic of patients suffering from PTSD is that they are often overtaken by traumatic past memories. Such permanent involuntary preoccupation with the past might hinder active thinking or planning for the future, and might thus result in a passive time-moving orientation to the future. This way, PTSD patients literally might be stuck in the past. First-person accounts of people with PTSD further support this stuck-in-time hypothesis. One U.S. Army veteran suffering from PTSD and depression for instance, said, "I did experience a lot of different things in Afghanistan that really stuck with me. Rocking attacks, mortar attacks, convoys. Just being in a combat environment is such a scary thing to go through. Sometimes these people disagree, yo. I brought a lot of that home with me, and I felt stuck in my brain. I felt stuck. I felt like I guess I was still in Afghanistan in my head. Even though I was here, I was home with my wife and kids, but mentally I wasn't." Okay, so this is if being stuck in the past would result. Alright, so this is, stuck in the past. This is interesting because you could, if the metaphysics really does track this stuff, then the metaphysics might actually be relevant to PTSD, which would be super interesting for the metaphysicians, really, of time. Because if you're stuck in the past, and that really is sort of the correlated with like the block theories or the moving spotlight theories, then that would be a super cool result. I mean, I don't know. You have any questions, yo? I mean, the paper is just kind of on what people report when they say they have PTSD. I mean, I'm not a doctor. I don't know what people said, but this is just on reports of that and the sort of the phenomenology of PTSD according to the psychiatrists. So, I mean, it's sort of a report paper on phenomenology and PTSD. So, I mean, you can take it for whatever you want. I wouldn't go around saying that PTSD doesn't exist, except on the internet where there's no consequences. But, yeah. If being stuck in the past would result in a passive outlook into the future and in patients with PTSD, how could that show in the eyes of patients with PTSD? In a recent ocular investigation into PTSD, Stocker, Plichka, Bakic, Schneider, and Faltz under review investigated just this question. Recent ocular motor studies in episodic memory and temporal processing of words have shown that our eyes unconsciously look more up when thinking about the future than the past. This suggests that our eyes unconsciously follow a mental timeline in which the future is located higher than the past. Given this ocular motor future up finding, Stocker, Plichka, and colleagues hypothesized that patients with PTSD display downward eye movement during future thought, that the future is approaching them from above and that the eyes follow this downward path, reflecting time-moving future thought. In contrast, they hypothesized that healthy people without a trauma history controls should generally be approaching the above future more actively and that the eyes follow an upward path into the future, reflecting ego-moving future thought. I mean, again, this is sort of a weird thing because this is saying that you would have to the PTSD is affecting the metaphysics of how they understand it. I don't know if that follows. It may just be that the initial reaction of certain people that get PTSD is to have the a certain metaphysical perspective. I don't know what the data is on psych and metaphysics. Like can a psych thing actually affect your metaphysical perspective? I'd just be more apt to think that some people were set up a certain way, then they had a traumatic experience, and that affected how their maybe their predisposition to the PTSD due to their metaphysics, or that this is the way they explained it to themselves just by chance at that time, and that's what has led to future problems. But yeah, so I don't actually, this stuff here, I wouldn't, this hypothesized, yeah, that this is what is going on. I don't know. I mean, it's real hard to get like empirical stuff to affect this sort of metaphysical perspective on time. I mean, there are things, of course, that can sort of affect your philosophical positions, but this just seems a little tenuous. But what do I know? I don't know about the psych and the interaction of psych and metaphysics. But yeah. Okay, where was I? Oh, their hypotheses were confirmed. Patients with diamond and goes to show what I know. Oh, gotta love it. Patients with PTSD show downward eye movements, and healthy controls showed upward eye movements while processing ego time moving ambiguous phrase. Well, okay. So I'm just gonna step back and say, well, look, no, this what it shows is that you've got certain people have a predisposition to stuff. It doesn't. There's only a correlation. There's not necessarily causation here. Ambiguous phrase with the ambiguous part of Wednesday's question above. See above. The former suggesting time-moving future thought, and the latter ego-moving future thought. I do like getting. It's quite fun where I say a whole bunch of stuff and then I'm just like, nope, you're wrong. Yeah, okay. Should the just mentioned initial findings from Stocker et al. Be replicated in future studies, then a PTSD treatment component could involve relearning to adopt a moving ego perspective more often to counteract being stuck in the past. Yes, I'm going to prescribe you to all read the literature on time travel. This could, for instance, involve imagining exercises where patients with PTSD could be instructed to visualize aspects of their future in moving ego terms. One could visualize a mental timeline as an upward path where only one mentally looks and moves upwards to various points in one's imagined future. The events to be approached could be highly individualized. One could, for instance, have various typical events that happen in a typical week of the patient and have her or him travel, looking and moving upward into the future on the imagined timeline from one future point to the next. From studies with healthy individuals, we do know that imagining moving forward can be enough to induce the moving ego modus. And that imagining moving forward can sometimes even work better in inducing a moving ego thinking modus than physically moving forward with our body. Well, I mean, I prescribe them to read some metaphysics on growing block theory and like the 4D worm. That would be cool. If it were possible to establish an ego-moving modus in patients with PTSD, then it is possible that this in turn might assist these people to counteract their tendency to be stuck in the past and to assist them in more actively shaping their future. One such ego-moving treatment idea is sketched in 2. Alright, so yeah. So this is the relative motion of time moving towards you when you're stationary, or you are moving towards the future because you are personally moving. Okay, alright now. Which one do we want to be doing? Things are moving towards you, I think, is the bad one. Or like you're getting attacked by the things coming at you. And then where you're moving toward is the one that's supposedly healthier. Okay. You can read the figure captions if you like. Alright, section 3. Over general memory and post-traumatic stress disorder. There is a seemingly straightforward task in certain psychological experiments where investigators read participants a cue word and where participants then have to recount a single specific memory, meaning an event that lasted less than 1 day. A cue word like rejected produces answers like, I got my paper rejected from a very good journal. That's what I think of rejected. Specific and overgeneralized vague memories examples. A few weeks ago, I had a meeting with my boss and my ideas were rejected. And B, my brothers are always talking about going on holiday without me. Okay, so this is the specific one. Well, I don't know what they're going to say. Okay, 2A is a correct answer. The event lasts less than 1 day. In contrast, 2B is obviously wrong. It is a generalized memory that refers to a much longer time span than 1 day. Yeah, always talking. Some sort of like they're gossiping about you. This latter phenomenon is called overgeneral memory in the literature and has been found to occur in relation to many psychological disorders such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated grief, suicidality, and schizophrenia. Moreover, it occurs to some extent also in healthy non-clinical populations. Patients with overgeneral memory often consistently fail to retrieve specific episodic memory in response to cue words, fail to retrieve memories like 2A, but instead retrieve non-specific memories that either extend over long periods of time or refer to categories of events. Okay, so like if I was to say, well, all the journal editors hate me and they are like plotting to keep me from making journals. Which is the idea that any of the journal editors have any idea who I am is sort of laughable. But yeah. That's what it would be in my case. Although, I did get a nice email back from a professor who I reviewed, and they were like, oh my god, you're over 100 of these things. I was like, yeah. I'm going to send the person a nice email back, and like, yeah, I'm starting to feel like a journal editor right now. Okay, there's clear evidence that overgeneral memory plays an important role in PTSD. On the one hand, research suggests that an overgeneral perspective on one's memories is a risk factor. In one study, Bryant et al., firefighters were first assessed during their initial training and then again 4 years later, at a time when they all had seen potentially traumatic events, such as seeing their comrades getting severely injured or killed. Those who already produced overgeneral memories during the first assessment were more likely to have developed PTSD by the second 4 years later. Okay, so this is what I was saying earlier about the how people are perceiving time. This could have been a like right here. This sort of thing, people can be predisposed to certain metaphysical perspectives, and if the metaphysical perspective is an indicator for developing the PTSD, then you can't say that the PTSD actually caused the metaphysical perspective. You can say they're correlated, but it's not causation there. So, okay. On the other hand, besides being a risk factor, research additionally suggests that overgeneral memory can also develop as a consequence of being exposed to potentially traumatic events. Yeah, so this is what's sort of interesting right here. Like, how does this happen? Like, develop as a consequence. This is like, I mean, they italicized the thing, because that's a big deal, that if you can force certain things to happen because of a traumatic event, I mean, how do you make people change their metaphysics? Okay, but this isn't specifically that. This is about memory. Overgeneral memory was, for instance, found to be much more prevalent in Bosnian and Serbian teenagers who were exposed to the horrors of war during childhood when compared to a no-war exposed Norwegian control group. The idea that overgeneral episodic memory possibly also extends to overgeneral episodic future thinking has not received much attention yet. However, there is, for instance, a study which shows that people with complicated grief not only produce overgeneral episodic memories, but also overgeneral episodic future thoughts. Since PTSD often comorbidly occurs with complicated grief, it is a likely but yet uninvestigated possibility that patients with PTSD without complicated grief might also have overgeneral thoughts about their future. I do wonder, like, when you're talking about kids who can't quite, because I mean, you're talking about teenagers here, Bosnian and Serbian teenagers. I have known some Bosnians and Serbs, and yeah, it's very strange to hear them talk about the wartime stuff, because I have not experienced that, and I don't really want to get into that stuff, because usually it goes very south very quickly. But it's like, yeah, if you are too young to really process what's going on, maybe developing this overgeneralized sort of memory is a coping mechanism, because you can't process the individual things. It all gets mushed together in your past as you grow up. You didn't understand it then, and then as it goes into your past, it's harder to really get specifics out of it. So, I mean, we only have what data we have to work with, but I mean, there's questions about how this all, I mean, complicated stuff. Yeah. War's bad, folks. Try to avoid that. Okay. In order to introduce an idea of how one could counteract overgeneral memory in individuals with PTSD in therapy, I first mentioned some findings of forensics. Recent forensic investigations, eyewitness memory studies have produced some strong first results that the use of pictorial timeline assists in eliciting more specific memories in adults, as well as in children from about age 7 onwards. I think that these studies, although set in a forensic context, are also of potential clinical relevance. I will mainly present the pictorial timeline technique and the results of Hope and colleagues now, as this is an adult study, and then relate it to potential applications, how the same slightly adopted applied timeline technique could be used for adult PTSD patients to help them overcome overgeneral and vague thoughts about the past, present, and future. I wonder about the vagueness of these thoughts and how it relates to what is actually, like, in the timeline. The relation to how time is moving to them. So the vagueness and then how time moves to the thing above. Okay. As terrible crimes such as homicide, violent assault, or rape also involve multiple perpetrators, Hope, Ghost, and Roberts shows a pictorial timeline technique to see adopting a standard mock witness program if such a timeline can assist in recalling a complex multi-actor incident. Participants watched a multi-perpetrator staged incident, a short film, to then either immediately or 2 weeks later report any details they could remember about the people, 5 perpetrators involved in the incident, as well as any actions or temporal sequence information. Compared to the standard free recall condition where people write down their account on blank sheets of paper, participants in the pictorial timeline condition provided highly significant, more correct information, regardless if they provide their account right after watching the video or only 2 weeks after having watched the video. These findings then open up the theoretical but yet uninvestigated possibility that people with post-traumatic stress disorder or other patients with overgeneral memory might also benefit from such a timeline technique to be able to retrieve more specific memories again. Oh, so this is these sort of these events get completely detemporalized. It's not that they are moving towards us or moving away from us as above. It seems like they're getting detemporalized, and even just getting them onto a timeline seems to be useful. Okay, that's interesting. So some things, so we got a few different things. I forgot what the first section was, but this was like detemporalization over here on this section. Then we've also got the other one was the relative motion of time above as making a difference. Can't remember what the first section was about. So my memory's gone. Shucks, I should have had a timeline. Alright, first, people who had no PTSD but who are likely to encounter potentially traumatizing events, for example, firefighters, and who at the same time show a tendency to recall events in an overgeneralized manner, could be trained to be able to recall their memories in a more specific manner before potentially traumatizing events occur. This should lessen their risk to develop PTSD after having encountered potentially traumatizing events. Second, people having experienced a potentially traumatic event, for example, people who have been exposed to the horrors of war, and who have subsequently developed PTSD and overgeneral memory because of it, could also benefit from regaining the ability to retrieve more specific memories. This might, for instance, relate to a stronger, more active sense of self. The timeline technique of Hope and colleagues consisted of a physical cardboard about 80 centimeters long and 30 centimeters wide, with a line running across the midpoint to each end representing the timeline, blank white person description cards, and blank yellow action description cards. Participants were instructed to use the person description cards to report any detail they could remember about the perpetrators, using one card for one person, to use the action cards to report any actions or sequence information, and to place the completed cards on the timeline in the right order, being free to reorder them when necessary. It is conceivable that the timeline technique of Hope and colleagues can also be used to help patients with PTSD and other patients with overgeneral memory in therapeutic settings to help these patients in regaining the ability to recall more specific memories. As in many cases, a longer time span and more than one event might be involved. Event cards could additionally be used, cards that each stand for one event. Thus, alright, so you're forcing people into ontologizing each event by using a person by using a card. Okay. Thus, this timeline technique for counteracting overgeneral memory would consist of a pictorial timeline, event cards, person cards, and action cards. And this sort of matters here. This this card here and like event cards, how this is broken down, sort of you're biasing the people to break up all the actions according to this ontology, event, person, action, along a timeline. So you're forcing people into a certain metaphysics here, actually, by doing the certain ontology. Okay, and then you could, of course, then bias this whole ontology according to the above perspective of the ego moving through time. So like you could show the ego card moving along. So that'd be cool too. One could take a certain time span in which the unspecific memories occur at the start and the end point of the timeline and work with the patient with the event, person, action, and perhaps still other cards to mentally zoom into the specific events. For illustration, take example 2b above, the overgeneral memory. My brothers are always talking about going on a holiday without me. In a first step, one could, for instance, encourage a patient making such a statement to indicate on the pictorial timeline in what time interval this happens. Yes, you're forcing them to narrow down the sort of overgeneral thing into this ontology here of specific actions of their plotting and events, which wouldn't work in the overgeneralized case. All right, for instance, if this timeline in front of you represents the time span of 1 year ago up to now, can you place these event cards on the timeline to indicate how often it has roughly happened that your brothers talked about going on a holiday without you? For instance, if you think that it might have happened roughly 4 times within last year, then please indicate this by accordingly placing the event cards to 4 different points on the timeline. Of course, no one can do this because this is all hearsay, so you'd have to this is a sort of a biased thing to begin with, but that doesn't mean they weren't plotting against the person, but it's just very hard to do because plotting is normally done in secret anyway. But okay. I mean, it seems like a good strategy in terms of therapy. Alright, in later sessions, the patients could gradually be encouraged to zoom in into one of the events. For instance, now I would like you to mentally zoom into one of these points, into one of these events. Let's take the point the last point on the timeline. Try to imagine that you are mentally moving into this single event so that you are in the midst of it. What do you see? Please write it down on the person and action cards, and then place these cards to the event card on the timeline. Yeah, see, now you're pushing everything into your like specific ontology here, which sort of breaks up the overgeneralization. Okay. Okay, more specific memory retrieval is also thought to be associated with more field memory retrieval. Interesting name. As Pothigadu and colleagues think in the context of schizophrenia, more specific memories and more field perspectives might help patients to regain a sense of more active and stronger self again. Although patients with PTSD are, of course, an entirely different clinical population than patients with schizophrenia, it still stands to reason that PTSD patients could also benefit from more specific memories and more field perspectives. Oh, that's right. This was the field perspective was the initial one for similar cases. As the field perspective should induce a strong sense of being inside one's body, more of such a perspective might indeed help assist such patients with PTSD to regain a more active approach to life again. Okay. Yeah, so this is sort of pulling all the stuff together, I guess. So one event. So instead of the alright, whatever. These are, you have to break things into individual events as opposed to as one giant event across the whole future. And alright, conclusion. This article has shown that the phenomenological temporal experience associated with PTSD might have clear mental perspective correlates, and that these correlates could possibly be used advantageously in treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Excessive observer memories might be counteracted with an embodied ocular field intervention. Excessive time-moving perspectives with embodied ocular ego-moving imagination exercises, and excessive vague overgeneral memories with an embodied hands-on timeline technique. As mentioned prior to application in therapeutic setting, these three embodied mental perspectives in intervention ideas would need to be carefully investigated. An advantage of any attempt, including the attempt made in this article to relate phenomenological temporal experience to PTSD to embodied contents, is that the abstract nature of temporal experience is viewed in the light of concrete embodied correlates. These possible connections between embodied mental perspectives and temporal experience in PTSD might give trauma therapy potentially an additional tool for taking up the challenge to counteract negative temporal experience associated with PTSD. Well, this was a little different from what I've been reading, but it was very interesting because this is directly relating the phenomenology to the I guess you'd say the problems that are associated with PTSD, how they actually are played out, and then you're trying to get people to take on metaphysical views, really, of how they are describing and understanding experiences according to different metaphysical perspectives that are associated with less mental disorder. Now, what's hard about this is, of course, from the philosophical perspective, I don't really have a care what your. I mean, I have some sort of like background assumptions about what the metaphysics of time should be and what's right, what's wrong. But it seems odd that this might give evidence that certain metaphysics of time are better in the sense that they're better for us. So, there'd be an interesting argument to be made that you shouldn't adopt certain metaphysics of time because it's just gonna wear on you eventually, in terms of mental problems. So this would be a therapeutic sense of a philosophy, actually, that if you can go and learn these other metaphysics that are counteractive to what the bad ones are, then the metaphysics of time actually would be a good therapy. Yeah. So we got growing block theory, perspectivalism, based on the ego, and then the ontology of events, which is not what I was expecting when I started reading this paper, but is a very welcome surprise to me. Alright, I don't have a whole lot more to say because this was sort of a report. Granted there was the correlation issue here, but given the nature of this article, that's not really wasn't a serious problem. Other than that, yeah, I don't have anything else to say. I guess that's it for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you have any questions, and please let me know. And send me papers if you like. Stay safe out there, and yo, Pierre, don't be a hater on stuff like this. It's just not worth it. Good night.